Rachel, but oh, the meeting is being recorded. Okay, I'm going to get to that bit in just a minute. There are some people here who may not know who I am and may not know who Rachel is, so I'm just going to announce myself. I'm Phil Cavendish. I'm co-chair of the Russian Cinema Research Group, along with Rachel Morley. This is a historic moment for the group because it's the first event that we've ever hosted online, so it's quite a big deal. It's quite a nerve-wracking deal as well, but I'm glad that so many of you are here to be here and to be present for this evening seminar, which is going to be given by Misha Yakovlev from the University of Warwick. Before I introduce Misha, I just want to say a few words about the forthcoming program this year and also the etiquette for this meeting. Rachel and I wrote to all the members of the research group last week to give in broad outline our plans for the forthcoming year. And apart from the event that's taking place this evening, we have a roundtable discussion that's taking place on the 2nd of December, which is going to be devoted to Ilya Hrynovsky's Thaw project. We will be giving you more information about how exactly that event is going to be organized and what form it's going to take nearer the time. For those of you who are interested in participating, it will involve accessing some of the films that have already been made available on the Thaw project official website. And there is a cost attached to that, but it's not a very high cost. We also have some further events planned for the spring and summer, which I outlined in that email.
I'm sorry. Thank you. Thank you so much.
That's okay. Was that you, Candice?
Yes, I'm sorry. The joys of being in a domestic situation. Just, it's all good. Thanks, Phil.
Okay,
sorry about that.
Wonderful. We indicated in our email that we would be going for Microsoft Teams as the online platform, but after talking to our events manager and thinking about it a bit more, we decided to move to Zoom. It just makes it easier to hand over presentational functions. I'm assuming that the vast majority of you are familiar with Zoom, and I hope that we don't experience any technical problems this evening, but I'm sure that if we do, you'll be sympathetic and patient. In a few moments, as I start to introduce Misha, I'd be very grateful if you could put your microphones off for the duration of the presentation and also switch your cameras off. This meeting is being recorded, so if you're not comfortable about switching on your cameras at any stage, either during the presentation or the question and answer session that's going to take place after the presentation, then that's absolutely fine. There is a chat function which will allow you to indicate after the presentation is over that you would like to ask a question. So if you simply put in that chat function, I would like to ask a question, then I can ask you to unmute yourself and put that question. We're aiming to last, for this event to last about 75 minutes. So about 45 minutes plus for Misha's presentation and then a Q&A afterwards. We don't want to go much longer than that because concentration spans are limited for something like an online platform like this. If that's all clear and it's all understood, I'm going to go on and proceed to introduce Misha. The first thing to say is that Misha prefers the use of the singular pronoun they. Misha is currently doing a PhD research project in film and television studies at the University of Warwick. And that PhD is about shifting gender and ethnic normativities in perestroika era Soviet and post-Soviet Russian cinema. Misha has a connection with UCL already, courtesy of the fact that they did the Gender, Society and Representation MA at UCL. And Misha also wrote an MA dissertation, which was supervised by Rachel, which was on gender and Orientalist normativities in the comedies of, or the Leonid Gaidai's comedies of the 1960s. And I imagine that there's going to be some connection between that presentation and the presentation that Misha is going to be giving this evening, the title of which is Translating Queer Theory into Russian, Gender and Coloniality in Leonid Gaidai's Comedies from the 1960s. So I'm going to be muting myself. I'm also going to be switching off my camera for the duration, but otherwise, thank you very much, Misha, for joining us this evening, and we look forward to hearing your presentation.
Okay, let me just try to share my screen. Well, thank you for the introduction and for inviting me to speak. As you say, my paper today is based, well, basically it's based on my MA thesis, so it's obviously quite limited in scope. And I also want to thank Rachel Morley for supervising my thesis and for kind of inviting me to speak here. To give a brief overview, this paper subjects Leonid Gaidai's Comedies from the 1960s to critical rereading informed by queer and queer decolonial thinking. My interest in these theoretical questions or issues was born from a gradual realization that a number of key critical frameworks that I focused on in my studies, namely queer, de and postcolonial and critical race theories, or even post-structuralism itself, tend to be overlooked in scholarship on Soviet culture and especially film and television. Not always, but talking more specifically about these films, scholarship about the cinema of the Soviet Thaw emphasizes a certain break with the rigid political narratives of social realism, and a newly found preoccupation with the internal struggles of the ordinary Soviet person, usually a man and to a lesser degree woman. Well, this might be the case. My overarching argument today is that Gaidai's comedies actually actively participate in the construction and maintenance of the gendered colonial matrix that permeates Soviet culture, but also precedes it. I argue that these comedies, first of all, construct Soviet Russia as a world segregated along the binary of sex, and second, they overdetermine the very concept of sex or gender with a tripartite colonial or civilizational script. By that I mean that these films construct the Orient, both domestic and sort of the Soviet Orient and a foreign capitalist Orient, as the binary other of Soviet Russia. In line with this, normative Soviet Russian gender is defined not only through the obviously constructed notion of binary sexual difference, but a gender race matrix. To give one example, it positions the normative Soviet woman, worker, and mother as the binary other of the repressed Oriental woman, of the sexually repressed Oriental woman. As both Brian Bayer and Dan Healy have written, if not at length, this matrix also positions Soviet gender and race as the binary other of the hyper-civilized West, whatever that might mean. This West and Western culture in general has a shadowy presence in this paper because my specific interest is the Soviet cinematic constructions of the colonized or terrorized/terrorist body, to borrow from the term coined by Jasper Polarin, terrorist assemblages from a nationalism in queer times. Before we go any further, let me briefly, so just as an aside, my research was quite theoretical, so my talk will be quite theoretical as well. And before we go any further, let me provide some working definitions of two crucial terms that I use. First of all, queer. So my understanding of queer is not as a fixed sexual identity, but a relational anti-normative positionality, broadly aligned with this quote from David Halperin's Saint Foucault towards a gay hagiography. I'll read it. Unlike gay identity, which they deliberately proclaimed as in an act of affirmation, is nonetheless rooted in the positive fact of homosexual object choice, queer identity need not be grounded in any positive truth or in any stable reality. As the very word implies, queer does not name some natural kind or refer to some determinate object. It acquires its meanings from its oppositional relation to the norm. So queer is by definition, whatever is at odds with the normal, the legitimate, and the dominant. There is nothing in particular to which it necessarily refers. In my PhD, and in general, I try not to quote Anglo-American cis-white heterosexual men, well, although Halpern's not heterosexual men researchers, in line with kind of decolonial citational strategies pioneered by people like Sarah Ahmed and Gloria Anzaldúa. But this is an accessible overview of a relational understanding of queer as I use it. At the same time, it points to some violent exclusions in queer theory, at least in its early manifestations, such as socioeconomic status, race, ethnicity, and perhaps more surprisingly, gender. This is something Jasbir Puar talks about in Terrorist Assemblages, and she provides some valid critiques of Halpern's definitions because its emphasis on non-normativity can semiotically be read to exclude certain bodies like Muslim women. More recently, scholars like Fatima El-Tayeb and Debanush Dasgupta have theorized queerness with particular attention to racialized bodies and borders. And here's some works that explore these issues further. So specifically for the purposes of this paper, I seek to translate queer for the reading of Russian culture in two interrelated ways. First, as a critical approach that seeks to uncover the ways in which Soviet culture, especially Gaidai's films, construct certain subjects and places as normative and reject others, such as the cloistered Muslim woman, as pathological. And second, to recognize the overlooked queer, in the sense of disruptive, potentiality of these subjects on screen. So the second term or couple of terms that I want to briefly engage with are Soviet and Russian. As I'm sure many of you know, Russian language has two words that translate to Russian and English, and one is Rossiyskaya, which accurately translates to pertaining to the Russian state, and the other one is Russkaya, which accurately translates to ethnically Russian or pertaining to the Russian language. So making this distinction might seem pedantic, and indeed a lot of scholarship in English and in Russian does not really make this distinction. And if we look at Russian politicians today, they definitely don't make this distinction in a meaningful sense. And even the word Soviet is often used interchangeably with Russian without any explanation as to why and what exactly they mean by Russian. So these fissured and untranslatable terms speak to the very core of my academic concerns. As Louis Althusser wrote, and I'm paraphrasing, ideology never comes out as ideological, it erases its own trace. And there's no time to discuss these issues in detail, but I use the word Russian and Soviet interchangeably when speaking about culture to mark the violently exclusionary ethnically Russian basis for Soviet culture, and also linguistic Russian basis for Soviet culture, including cinema. Yeah. So here are some publications again, which engage explicitly with this dominant but unmarked basis of Russian culture and society. Now, this paper as a whole and my specific research questions were born from, as I said, what I see as certain omissions and fissures in Soviet screen scholarship. To name notably the relative dearth of decolonial and gender/sexuality-based scholarship. Writing on the role of Orientalism and colonialism in Russian culture does exist. In green, I have highlighted some works that played a role in shaping my investigation of Gaidai's films, and in yellow, there are some texts that I find problematic. I see two interconnected problems with most of these interventions. First, almost all of them deal with literature and not cinema. And second, the focus on literary form maps neatly onto a temporal preoccupation with pre-Soviet, or at best early Soviet Russian culture. This can be explained, in my opinion, by a tendency to dismiss the applicability of the very concept of Orientalism and decolonial thought more broadly defined to Russian and especially Soviet Russian culture, and especially cinema. Two types of reasoning is generally offered for this type of dismissal. First, it is often argued that Russian and especially Soviet Russian colonialism does not fit the Western pattern and is not colonialism at all. Second, both Western and Russian authors argue that Russian culture cannot be Orientalist because Russia itself is Oriental. For example, David van der Rohe's volume Russian Orientalism emphasizes Russia's greater intimacy with the Orient in comparison to some unspecified West, and the lack of specificity is kind of important. Likewise, I'm sure many of you will be familiar with the Russian writing on internal colonization, pioneered by people like Alexander Etkind and Boris Groys. Personally, the whole idea of using colonization as an analogy for the predicament of lowbrow ethnic Russians as characters in Russian literature mostly is neither useful nor appropriate, because the Russian reader and the Russian viewer is always allowed, and I would argue encouraged, to identify with the parochial Russian peasant, the Russian matron, the peasant matron, and other characters in that vein. So in his article, Is the Post and Post-Colonial, the Post and Post-Soviet Towards a Global Post-Colonial Critique, David Chechiny Moore provides very useful deconstructions of this unhelpful colonial West versus semi-Oriental Russian binary discourses that we can find in academia. First of all, as you can see from this quote, Moore kind of takes issue with this idea that Orientalism as a concept is not applicable to Russian culture. And secondly, the basis of many of these arguments and kind of apparent material differences between Russian and Western colonialism also do not really hold. I'll give you a minute just to read the quote. And one of the reasons I find Moore's intervention quite productive is because it points to specific cultural texts that are often read as sort of as examples or critiques of Western Orientalism, but also can be seen to apply to Russia, which in this case is Rudyard Kipling's works. Now, one notable exception when it comes to postcolonial engagement with Soviet film is Laura Michaels's article Prisoners of the Caucasus, From Colonial to Postcolonial Narrative, which traces a number of adaptations to the original Prisoner of the Caucasus story, including one of the films I discuss, which is Gaidai's Kafkazskaya Plenitsa, or Woman Prisoner of the Caucasus. The official translation is slightly different, but disappointingly, however, Michaels concludes that Gaidai's film is about gender more than it is about colonialism. As you can see from that quote, this reasoning performs an erasure of colonial and racist traumas perpetuated in this film. I return to this later, but briefly, I want to challenge this assertion that we laugh at Shurig, because we don't laugh at him, we laugh with him, at the expense of the uncivilized Orientals. Gaidai's framing of the diegesis through Shurik's ethnographic expedition explicitly references racist conventions of classic Hollywood ethnographic expedition film, exemplified by King Kong, the whole idea of going somewhere to study the local customs or the local people. Likewise, the very casting of a white Romanian Welsh actress to play Nina, the character who gets kidnapped in the film, is racist in itself. Less specifically, Michaels's investment in maintaining a separation between gender and coloniality is somewhat typical of existing literature that fails to account for and center intersectionality. As you can see from the slide, there is also some academic literature on gender in Soviet culture and film, even if gender often gets reduced to analysis of women, implied heterosexual and white on the Soviet screen. At best, researchers discuss queer or non-heterosexual aesthetic in Sergei Parajanov's films like Sayat Nova. But even then, little attention is paid to intersectional dynamics between gender, sexuality, and coloniality. There are some exceptions. In green, I have highlighted a book by a queer film scholar, Rosalind Gold, that brings some interesting perspectives on Parajanov, and Lena Zhigalita's queer take on Kira Muratova's films, which pays attention to intersectionality through the category of nation, which was published in this year's edition of Another Case. When it comes to Gaidai's films, however, nothing has been written from a queer or decolonial perspective in either English or Russian, as far as I can tell. As far as I can tell, I need to emphasize this. The same can be said about the same can be said about other non-auteur popular Soviet cinema from the Thaw and stagnation periods. But why do I think it's necessary to bring these two strands of critique or thinking, queer and decolonial, to bear on Gaidai's films, specifically in Soviet cinema in general? So let's start from the general. If we turn to Black feminism in the US or in this country, decolonial and global South queer feminisms, etc., the need to account for intersectional dynamics of cultural representation has been well argued and theorized. For example, this quote from Bell Hooks' The Entire Woman criticizes the very category American woman for its unmarked racial and indeed racist exclusions. In most of their writing, the white American woman's experience is made synonymous with the American woman's experience. While it is in no way racist for any author to write a book exclusively about white women, it is fundamentally racist for books to be published that focus solely on the American white woman's experience, in which that experience is assumed to be the American woman's experience. Similarly, I argue that in the USSR and Russia today, the category Soviet woman, or just woman, in research and in cultural discourse more broadly, excludes non-heterosexual women and non-white or non-ethnically Russian women, whose gender expression and sexuality are often constructed as pathological or threatening. Despite a real lack of theorizing in this, consider this extract from a conversation Russian sociologist Oля Reznik had with two Chechen feminists in Grozny around 2008. In a similar way to Poir, I use the term queer then to describe Muslim women and other bodies denied subject status in Soviet cultural discourse in a similar way to what Lila describes experiencing. And again, I'll give a moment for everyone to read the quote. And this sort of pervasive idea of a different variety or a different species of women when it comes to Orientalism is, it's very important in general. Okay, so what was my methodology? So to make the kind of, for reading Gaidai's films more specifically, I read them as reflections of the broader heteronormative racist discourse of the Soviet Russian state. In other words, I read them as apparatuses that actively participate in the construction and maintenance of this discourse. I base this on Louis Althusser's theory of ideological state apparatuses, which he elaborates in a chapter called Ideology and Ideological State Apparatuses. Notes towards an investigation in his book Marxism and Lenin. Sorry, I forgot the book's name. Althusser distinguishes between two types of state apparatuses used to maintain control by the state: the repressive apparatus of the state, like the police, prisons, military, and the less obviously coercive ideological state apparatuses, or ISAs, that predominantly function through ideological indoctrination that manufactures social consensus around certain issues, in a somewhat similar way to Gramsci's concept of hegemony, or to Stuart Hall's ideas about coding and decoding. Of course, in addition to naturalizing certain certain ideologies, ideological state apparatuses also actively construct group and individual identity or subjectivity, as I think Althusser calls it, to match this consensus. Althusser emphasizes that unlike the repressive apparatus of the state, ISAs may not be explicitly a mouthpiece for state ideology, for example, private media companies or families. But ultimately, ISAs realize the ideology of the ruling class, which in the USSR was a type of colonially and heteronormatively inflected state socialism that manufactured identities like women, Soviet women, but also Oriental women as distinct categories. And here is a quote from Althusser where he explains about state power. So, of course, we all know that in the USSR until the final years of its existence and also during NEP, cinema production was in the hands of the state, although there was a slight loosening of censorship during the Thaw period, which more or less matches onto Gaidai's golden decade, which was the 1960s. And importantly, for a particular ISA to function effectively, it needs to be quite dominant in its reach, quite pervasive in its reach. For example, in Can the Subaltern Speak, Gayatri Spivak identifies the colonial school system in India as such a pervasive ISA that ensured the local elites, at the very least, accepted colonialism and based their own identities around it. This is precisely why I chose to focus on Gaidai's comedies from the 1960s, their extreme popularity. Elena Prokhorova, who describes Gaidai as the king of Soviet comedy and calls the 1960s his golden decade, also alerts us to the fact that Gaidai is the only director responsible for 3 out of 10 highest grossing Soviet films of all time. And all of these, which are Apparatuses and Другие приключения Шурика, Operation Y and Shurik's Other Adventures, Kavkazskaya Plenitsa, или Новые приключения Шурика, Woman Prisoner of the Caucasus, as I translated, and Бриллиантовая рука, or The Diamond Arm, came out in the 1960s. Interestingly, their popularity seems to endure in attenuated form, of course, in Russia and perhaps in other post-Soviet states to this day. In addition, these films, and Gaidai's films in general, are often perceived as the closest Soviet cinema got to apolitical entertainment, or non-ideological entertainment, I should say, probably, which according to Althusser will make them even more effective in their ideological tasks, because, and I'm quoting here, one of the effects of ideology is the practical denigration of the ideological character of ideology by ideology. Ideology never says I'm ideological. So, based on this, bearing all of this in mind, my MA thesis posed 2 research questions that are, can queer and post-structuralist theorizing reveal how Gaidai's comedies construct certain white subject as gender and sexually queer? Can decolonial and queer decolonial theorizing supplement the above by revealing how these comedies also reduce colonized, Oriental, and largely Muslim bodies to uniform queer objecthood through a discursive relationship of binary and hierarchical difference from the Soviet Russian norm. So what did I find, so to speak? My analysis is split in 2 parts with 2 chapters each. Okay. So first, I argued that Gaidai's comedies construct homosocial worlds that construct and naturalize the gender binary between Russian man and woman. My idea of cinematic worlds or worlding is in tension with Skunova and Galt's description of queer cinematic worlding in their book Queer Cinema in the World. And here is a quote to illustrate what they meant by it, by the concept of worlding. Of course, unlike them, I'm arguing that these films do settle a particular cartography and try to naturalize it. So, okay. The clearest example of homosocial worlding in these films comes from Barbos and the Unusual Cross and Bootleggers, which are 2 early shots which kick-started Gaidai's career and introduced the ubiquitous trio of goofy criminals known as the Vinimor to the Soviet screen. These films feature no women characters at all. So how can we read this erasure? According to research on men's homosociality, men cement heterosexual bonds with other men through hierarchical men-only socialization. Here, I argue that these films construct or articulate ideal or normative masculinity through tiered hierarchical difference from more marginal masculinities and discrete binary difference from women by means of such hierarchical men-only socialization. The specific internal homosocial hierarchy that these films establish places Yevgeny Morgunov's seasoned criminal character at the top, Andrei Nikulin's Dunes character somewhere in the middle, and Georgy Vitsin's coward character at the bottom. This hierarchy is maintained in other films, in other Vinimore films. Alexander Prokhorov argues that this hierarchy is first communicated through the physical incongruity of Vinimore's bodies. Here is one still from Barbos, the first Gaidai comedy, with potentially phallic overtones as an illustration of his point. I return to the queer elements in the iconography of Nikulin and Vitsin's characters a little later. Here, consider how the tall, strong, and portly Morgunov visually dominates his companions. This character's overall appearance intersects with the pre-Soviet iconography of the virile, ethnically Russian bogatyr, or knight, if you try to translate the term, whom Helena Gaskila describes as the redoubtable protector of national borders and Orthodox Christianity in her paper titled Viktor Visnetsov Bogatyrs, Mythic Heroes and Sacrosanct Borders Go to Market. While Gaidai translates this iconography through the prism of humor, or more specifically side gag, we should know that Nikulin is neither while Gaidai translates this iconography through the prism of humor and through the prism of humor, and Morgunov's character is not necessarily positive, we should note that he is neither cowardly nor an idiot like the other two. In fact, his Russian masculinity is constantly emphasized. We frequently see him perform emphatically macho physical tasks. For example, in this still, we see topless Morgunov lift up an exaggeratedly large log in order to give himself a snow shower. Of course, aspects of this macho iconography of real Russian men persist to this day. Mr. Putin often appears topless, and in photographing Vladimir Putin, Andrew Foxall argues that such photographs naturalize Mr. Putin's toxic gender binary masculinity, more or less defined through difference from queerly passive femininity, as normative and aspirational. Here are some images. Likewise, I believe Bavali functions as a model of pre-Soviet Russian masculinity, which then gets reinvigorated by Russian nationalism today. In other words, like these photographs, Barbos is an ISA. And if we look at the activities Mr. Putin likes to do topless, they are usually quintessentially masculine homosocial activities like hunting or fishing. And of course, Barbos is a film about a fishing trip, whereas Bootleggers is set around the activity of producing alcohol, which was illegal in the USSR. So what I'm trying to demonstrate here is that these Vinimore films fall into and perpetuate a cultural metatext that not only defines normative masculinity through a certain performative virility, but tethers it to specific occupational and recreational behavior like fishing, disrespect for forestry rules, and alcohol consumption and Barbos. In Bootleggers, as I already mentioned, it is not only alcohol consumption, but alcohol production, a criminal offense in the USSR at the time, that becomes the privileged activity and site of men's homosociality. So I'm not necessarily arguing that this film defines bootlegging as part of normative Soviet masculinity. Instead, I want to recognize that women's exclusion from the categories criminal and law enforcement alike that operate in these films. And we do meet some Soviet police, unlike the criminals, and they are all men. Here is a still from Bootleggers, and I'm not sure whether you're familiar with the film, but basically the dog steals a coil from the moonshine machine and brings it to the police, which leads to the Vinimor trio being arrested. Gaidai's other films are less extreme in the sense that they feature women characters, so the homosexuality is not total. Nevertheless, all Gaidai films keep women sequestered within the proverbial kitchen. In particular, I argue that Operation Y, a comedy film consisting of 3 self-contained shorts, known as an almanach in Russian, that were particularly popular during the Soviet time, naturalize heteronormativity by constructing a rigid set of binary gender roles and promising chaos when these roles are troubled. The first short in Operation Y, which is Naparnik or partner, opens with Shurik helping the student Shurik helping women to board the bus, which causes him to miss the bus multiple times. Sorry, you can't really see the photograph. You can't really see the still. When Shurik is finally able to board the bus himself, he finds himself in the middle of a brawl. The first 4 seats on the bus are reserved for people living with disability and passengers with children. Unfortunately, 2 of them are occupied by a drunkard who refuses to move his satchel of empty bottles to accommodate a pregnant woman, arguing that she is neither with children nor living with disability. Shurik intervenes on the behalf of the woman, provoking a fight that lands the drunkard in police custody for disruptive behavior. Interestingly, just like the bootleggers, this film refuses to screen any woman either working or incarcerated inside the jail. Overall, this bus scene does 2 things. First, it constructs a heteronormative diegetic world within which a woman requires man's help and protection, even in the most mundane of situations. Second, and relatedly, this text reduces the category of woman to child. On the one hand, she is infantilized to the level of the child by her apparent vulnerabilities. Fittingly, Shurik helps children to get on the bus alongside grown women. On the other hand, a woman's very existence is defined through and subjugated to the heteronormative and, as I argue below, heteronationalist imperative to produce the child. The third and eponymous short, Operation Y, seeks to naturalize this implicit messaging by explicitly constructing women as biologically programmed for nurture and men for defensive and public roles. Appearing once again, Vinimor, the trio of criminals known as Vinimor, are commissioned by a corrupt collective farm official to stage a burglary of his farm's storehouse in order to foil the state inspection coming to inspect his stock, which he has already stolen himself. Vinimor seem hesitant to take the job because an unsuspecting guard will be involved. To convince them, the collective farm promises that he has arranged for a frail Baba Shura, Grandma Shura, to be the guard on duty during the robbery. Unfortunately, though, Baba Shura asks Shurik to babysit her granddaughter while she works. And here is a brief clip of what happens next. I hope this works. I'm sorry. This is not the end of the scene, but I think it's enough to illustrate that the kind of this kitchen sequence of Shurik babysitting the child. Okay, sorry, yeah, so the sequence from which I have just shown you the clip actually actively constructs Russian man and the category of man as naturally unable to fulfill certain caring tasks, and conversely it eulogizes the Russian man as the normative and the effective defender of the Soviet state. After being unable to cope in the kitchen, Shurik convinces Babashura to swap jobs, so to speak, and is able to foil the plan of the corrupt collective farm official by capturing Vinimor and handing them in to Soviet police. Of course, in later films, Shurik likewise acts as an agent of Soviet justice by subjugating Oriental masculinity in Woman Prisoner of the Caucasus, for example. So one has to wonder if Shurik is a heterosexual white Russian man who is actively involved in the maintenance of Soviet law and order, but is constructed as unable to fulfill certain traditionally feminist tasks. How can the Soviet world, ever claim to be sort of gender or sexually equal? To begin my own answer, to answer my own question, by simultaneously constructing man, the category man, as unable to cope in the domestic setting, and showing woman, especially when old and frail, which is ageist and ableist, as unable to protect the state, this specific film, or I say, perpetuates the unmarked heteronormative nature of official Soviet ideology, especially when it comes to labor policy. I'm sure many people know that employment was both a right and obligation for all Soviet citizens, but gender specialization in formal employment was encouraged, and after the Second World War, enforced through law. And to this day in Russia, there is a list of professions that are not open to women. Disproportionately engaged in poorly paid, physically demanding manual and semi-skilled labor, like being a night watchman, ironically, Soviet woman was expected to do all unpaid childcare, household work, a situation dubbed the double burden or the contract of working mother, and sociological scholarship, which, yeah. Okay. So I'm really sorry, I got slightly confused with my own notes, but I'll just try to go back on track. So while the early films construct man's leisure and also a certain type of labor performed by men as sort of homosocial and try to maintain the rigid gender-based segregation, some other films nevertheless acknowledge the possibility of the potential existence of gender sexually non-normative subjects. In line with the ghostly nature of the lesbian and other gender sexually queer women in most cultures around the world, Gaidai's films refuse to entertain the very possibility of gender sexually non-normative Russian women. At the same time, they construct concrete alternatives, or I should say they engender concrete alternatives to Shurik's righteous Soviet Russian masculinity and Margonov's Russian hypermasculinity, both of which can be read as generational and or class alternatives of the same heteronormative script. In the Slavic Review, Alexander Prokhorov praises Gaidai for emphasized comic ambiguity rather than goal-oriented satire, which is achieved by privileging visual humor of the side gag that functions through the play of alternative interpretations projected by the image. Prokhorov describes the layered meanings of some side gags deployed by Gaidai's films that can be plausibly read as a critique of the Soviet state, as this quote shows. In other words, Prokhorov is arguing, as you can see, that the side gag of that scene where the Vinimor trio sit on the bank of the river fishing can be read in multiple names, in multiple ways. Notably, the range of state officials might be seen to emerge as complete morons who cannot tell a rod from a tree trunk. Unfortunately, Prokhorov's reading does not account for the fact that Gaidai's side gags often rest on heteronormative basis. More specifically, his films buttress heteromasculinity by constructing the effete non-heterosexual man, or by constructing the ghost of the effete non-heterosexual man as comedic relief for the viewer and diegetically prosthetic wife for the hetero man. I want to give 3 examples of such comedic couples present in Gaidai's films. Staying with the Operation Y trilogy first, the partner short translates freak show humor for the Soviet screen, sort of translates the visual form of the freak show humor for the Soviet screen by performing a parade of antisocial elements marching out of jail on the way to communal labor in the morning. None of the characters speak. Instead, the camera exhibits and zooms to highlight their freakish or queer appearance and mannerisms for the amusement of the normative Soviet viewer. Interestingly, the camera lingers on a number of occasions on what I read like a queer couple composed of a Russian hyper-masculine man and his prosthetic wife. The camera emphasizes the femininity of the shorter, slimmer, and younger prosthetic wife, who dotingly inserts a cigarette into the mouth of the muscly, bare-chested husband, an action in itself suggestive of oral intimacy, or at least intimacy. On a broader semiotic level, the scene constructs man's non-heterosexuality as either a gender pathology or a coping mechanism in the absence of women in prison, which reflects the conservative discourse about non-heterosexuality as gender inversion in Soviet medical literature, and also reflects the states for criminals in dissident writing. As Olga Zhuk explains in her pioneering volume, Ethnically Russian Amazons, the Lesbian Subculture in 20th Century Russia, Soviet dissidents were almost unanimous, Soviet dissident literature, I should say, was almost unanimous in its hostility towards non-heterosexuality as a perversion born from the Soviet prison system, and particularly common among what they described as non-political inmates. In addition, the character I decided to call the prosthetic wife wears a tie-dye t-shirt, which can be read to connote Westerners and the hippie movement, which was criticized by the Soviet ideology. And there are some posters that kind of play on this tie-dye imagery. In this way, the film also manages to code non-heterosexuality as a bourgeois Western perversion. While this couple is composed of tertiary characters that only appear in 2 brief scenes, my second couple are Murgunov and Vitsyn, who are the principal characters in all the Vinimor films, even if they're not always the protagonists. I argue that at least some of the constant side gags revolving around their bodily incongruity, which Prokhorov discusses, deploy Vitsyn's femme presentation to amplify the comedic effect of Morgunov's exaggerated bogatyr masculinity. For example, Vitsyn's character, the coward, quite literally borrows the iconography of a middle-aged Soviet woman by donning a headscarf and what looks like a women's fur coat in Operation Y. And I don't have time to discuss this now, but the history and the semiotic significance of the headscarf in Russian in Russian culture and history is quite charged. In Barbos, Witsen's character is more interested in stereotypically feminine things like smelling the flowers rather than consuming alcohol or fishing, much to Morgunov's amusement, and Morgunov actually goes on to ply the coward with alcohol. Finally, bootleggers use the coward's femininity, which is already coded into his nickname. Coward is, bravery in Russian is mужество, which literally means manliness. So a coward, semiotically, is the opposite of a man. To present him as Morgunov's prosthetic wife in a surprisingly explicit manner, as the bootlegging trio hear unidentified sounds from outside their hut, the coward grasps onto Morgunov's hand in a tactile expression of the heteronormative ideology, which I outlined just above, with the scenes where Shurik helps women, that construct cis-het Russian man as the protective or alternatively threatening agent that acts on objectified or queer bodies, be it children, Russian women, or, as here, queerly gendered men. I won't show you the video from the scene, although it's quite interesting. Finally, the couple dynamics and iconography of the two smugglers, the fashionable and somewhat effeminate Gesha, who wears perfume and works as a model, and the brutish and actually ethnically specific, because he speaks with a very strong Ukrainian accent, Lulik, in the Diamond Arm, open themselves up for similar analysis. And here is the picture. So far, I have spoken about the insidious ways Gaidai's comedies construct and perpetuate Soviet heteronormativity. But the heteronormativity of all these comedies, if to a different degree, is inflected by Orientalism, which is the cultural manifestation of material colonialism. In chapter 3 of my thesis, I argued that two films, Woman Prisoner of the Caucasus and The Diamond Arm, construct a tiered Orientalist geography that constructs the Orient as the negative essence of the modern and moral Soviet space, positing Oriental lawlessness versus Soviet Russian order, and more specifically, gender and sexual queerness versus heteronormativity. First, what do I mean by Orientalist geographies? At its most basic, Edward Said explains that Orientalism boils down to geographical racial determinism. Of course, he's not talking about real geographies, but a particular type of ideological mapping, as Mary Pratt explains in Mapping Ideology, Gide, Camus, and Algeria. Under Orientalism, a kind of ideological map is superimposed on the geographical map. The result is an explanatory system designed to explain the economic and political appropriation of the South by the North. In the case of Russian Orientalism specifically, Leah Feldman explains that the Caucasus became the privileged site for the cultural manufacturing of Russia's Orient. While Feldman is talking about pre-revolutionary Russian poetry and prose, her argument is broadly applicable to both these films. Woman Prisoner of the Caucasus is set to both Woman Prisoner of the Caucasus and The Diamond Arm. Woman Prisoner of the Caucasus is set in an unnamed part of the Caucasus, although it was filmed predominantly in Krim or Crimea, which is another iconic Oriental site produced by Russian culture. Conversely, the Oriental city that functioned as the setting of the first half of the Diamond Arm's diegesis is meant to represent the capitalist or Western Orient, but was filmed in the Caucasus, in the city of Baku, Azerbaijan, to be more precise. As Fatima Tobin-Roney argues, the lack of specificity coupled with the panning wide angle establishing shots of the generally readable, that is stereotypical, Oriental topology both manufactures the Orient for the colonizer and slips to reveal its utterly constructed and ideological nature. Moreover, both Woman Prisoner of the Caucasus and The Diamond Arm follow the classical Hollywood ethnographic film formula of a journey from the knowable, here the Russian parts of the USSR, to the mysterious and unknowable, here the Orient. A cinematic form or a narrative structure that is semiotically and materially colonial. Now, what exactly do these essays want us to think about the Orient once we get there? Oh, I should have shown this later. First, both films construct the Orient as a site of lawlessness in marked contrast to Soviet Russia. The Diamond Arms Part 1 opens at the port of the fictional Soviet city Chernomorsk with the main character Gorbunkov boarding a cruise abroad. Later, as he disembarks at his Oriental destination, the camera assumes the point of view of the disembarked Soviet tourist to screen one of Baku's streets filled with scenic Oriental herds, mingling chaotically with various vehicles and animals, paying no regard to traffic rules or the gesticulating policemen. Given Otypil's ideology's emphasis on ordered modernization, I also read the presence of unmechanized vehicles as a subtext indicating the Orient's backwardness. This unmarked Orientalist code becomes painfully apparent when we contrast it with Gaidai's representations of Chernomorsk, or more poignantly, Moscow. For example, Operation Y lingers on Moscow's hyper-modern multi-lane roads, automatic signaling maintaining orderly separation of cars and public transport from pedestrians. The Diamond Arm uses some other strategies to construct and communicate Oriental lawlessness. To mention a significant one, we're repeatedly shown a prostitute openly plying her trade with no interference from the inefficient and likely corrupt Oriental police. Soviet ideology embraced Engels's theory that prostitution is a theoretical impossibility under socialism because it arises from capitalism's social and economic relations. In other words, Soviet Orientalism here forms a nuanced intersection with its anti-capitalism through this prostitute figure. Here is a still of the prostitute. As Woman Prisoner of the Caucasus is set in the Soviet Orient, the film hesitates in showing Caucasus's public spaces as lawless. After all, Soviet law applies formally, that is, on the surface. Instead, it constructs Oriental lawlessness through an extended visual metaphor between public order and inner darkness. For example, the film uses Comrade Sahov's office in the emphatically futuristic architectural style of public architecture pioneered by Khrushchev to foster a comic contrast between Soviet appearances and the Oriental nature, revealed by the animated haggling between Sahov and his driver Jabrail, who are trying to agree a price Sahov will pay for the bridal kidnapping of Nina, Jabrail's young and attractive niece visiting the mountains for the summer. The primitive and barbaric nature of this deal is further emphasized by the fact that they are counting Nina's price in goats, a semiotically charged and Islamophobic sign in Russian culture, instead of Soviet currency. A little bit later, the economic corruption of Comrade Sahov is communicated through his lavish and as such architecturally very un-Soviet villa, somewhat disturbingly named Eagle's Nest, where he keeps Nina and his ill-begotten wealth hidden in the mountains away from prying eyes of Soviet law enforcement. Speaking of which, the Sai constructs local police, all Oriental men, as neither more efficient nor less corrupt than Sahov, even if they can keep the traffic under control. For example, when Shurik is apprehended for alcohol-fueled vandalism, Sahov instructs the policeman to reconsider on the basis that Shurik was drunk only because he was collecting local toasts. Collecting local toasts is the ethnographic justification for his trip in the film. The policeman proceeds to rip up his report and reaches under the table, offering to share another wonderful toast with Shurik. Now, we can already see that these films code perverse gender and sexuality into Oriental lawlessness. More explicitly, I want to highlight that these films go further in mapping the Orient as an essentially homosocial site for the violent competition between two masculinities, messianic Soviet Russian masculinity and perverse Oriental masculinity. This mapping is achieved in three interconnected ways. First, these films deny Soviet Russian women access to the Orient, just like the early Vinimur films constructed the worlds of Russian men's leisure, work, and criminality as exclusively homosocial. In the Diamond Arm, the send-off scene I already mentioned simultaneously sees off gender sexual panic by establishing Gorbunkhov's upright Soviet heteronormativity by screening his nuclear family, and constructs the Orient as a dangerous zone where Soviet woman is not allowed to venture, by having Gorbunkov leave his family behind without clear justification for leaving them out of an exciting holiday cruise. Of course, some Soviet Russian women go on the cruise, but the film denies these women access to the Oriental city by firmly sequestering them inside the walking tour group led by a Soviet embassy official. The film firmly refuses to screen any of these women who were walking independently through the city after the tour finishes, focusing solely on Gorbunkov and Geshe's misadventures. And the woman prisoner of the Caucasus, the Soviet Caucasus, as yet more unrealistically, is devoid of Russian women. The only such woman to appear on screen is the peroxide blonde nurse at the local hospital. But of course, the camera constructs this hospital as an outpost of Soviet modernity in the oriental darkness of the Caucasus Mountains by flooding it in hygienic white light and staffing it with ethnic Russians, as you can see from the still. In general, Gaidai's films are full of such transparently racist visual metaphors that revolve around the binary of blackness as darkness and whiteness as light. Second, this film, Woman Prisoner of the Caucasus, constructs the local Oriental woman as thoroughly queer in the sense of perversely oppressed and near-mute, by mapping her existence out of the Orient's public spaces. Woman Prisoner of the Caucasus refuses to show us any local women on the street, with the exception of the public opening ceremony for the local wedding hall that only serves as an excuse to quite literally put Nina on a podium for to satisfy the heteroerotic gaze. Yet more remarkably, Nina is one of the only 3 women allowed to speak for the duration of the film. And just like the nurse, who is another character that speaks, she's not really an Oriental woman. Michaels, for example, describes her as a hybrid. Nina Zand is the only Oriental woman who speaks, and telling you she is mapped firmly out of the public space through being confined inside the home by her husband. In The Diamond Arm, as I mentioned already, Oriental woman is allowed public life, or sort of she's alive civilly, only as a prostitute, which according to Soviet ideology makes her a victim of exploitative capitalism. Alternatively, in other cases, she is erased from public space or hidden beneath the veil, which constitutes an erasure or a penetration of the public space of the public by the private. I return to this later. Having erased both Soviet and Oriental women then, both these films map the Orient as the exclusive domain of the Oriental man. On the one hand, and for example, there are frequent scenes of men's homosocial socialization, The Woman Prisoner of the Caucasus. On the one hand, this overrepresentation of the Oriental man betrays Russian paranoia about the perverse sexuality of Muslim men, which was on the minds of Soviet ideologues from the very beginning of the Bolshevik state, as evidenced by the often overlooked fact that in 1917, the Bolsheviks legalized homosexuality by striking down the entirety of the Tsarist legal code in the Russian Socialist Federative Soviet Republic, Belarus, and Ukraine, but actively chose to keep Tsarist articles relating to sodomy that applied only to men in all the Central Asian and Caucasus republics of the new Bolshevik and later Soviet state. Of course, in 1933, sodomy articles were reinstated throughout the USSR. On the other hand, these films deploy this overrepresentation to denote an aggressive threat ostensibly posed by the Oriental man to the Oriental woman, in order to justify the colonial intervention of the white Russian man. Of course, it is the white colonizer who is being threatened, which Woman Prisoner of the Caucasus slips to reveal by covertly screening the intensely queer, that is out of control, or terrorist in Poe's term, corporeality of Oriental man's muscular, hairy and perspiring body as a direct threat to the colonial Russian viewer by having the threatening body dominate the screen, either in itself or with the help of bulky Oriental clothing, especially swords and headgear. And this brings me to my final point. In order for the heteronationalism and the Orientalist mapping of these films to function, they must reduce all Oriental subject to the status of queer that is silent but highly charged and readable cinematic signs for the consumption of the Soviet Russian man, or just the normative Soviet viewer. Given that I have already talked about the iconography of the Oriental men in these films, let me turn to Oriental women. In his iconic, if somewhat misogynist paper, Algeria Unveiled, Frantz Fanon argues that the French colonialists turned the Algerian woman's veil into an easily readable image symbol of her own oppression and the overall backwardness of Algerian society. The French colonialist used this exteriority, the veil, as a target or threat to justify his apparently emancipatory colonialism. What is often left unacknowledged is that the USSR waged an equally colonial campaign against the veil throughout the 20s, 30s, and in some places even later, as you can see from these propaganda posters that come from different periods. The diamond arm deploys the broader cultural semiotics of the veil established by these posters for an iconic side gag whereby a veiled woman flees in terror, an exaggerated terror, from Gorbunkov, who had approached her to ask for directions. And this is really ironic because the diamond arm came out at the same time as Gilles Pontorkovo's communist and film La Bataille d'Alger, which was supported and kind of greeted and screened in the Soviet state. This scene does not only rely, but actively maintains colonialist and reductionist Soviet readings of the veiled woman as the oppressed in need of white intervention. In Woman Prisoner of the Caucasus, the aunt's colorful headscarf, or maybe it's a turban, takes the place of the veil. This film is more specific about the nature of the white intervention it advocates. Ultimately, Shurik is responsible for restoring Soviet law and freeing Nina. Michaels, Prokhorova, and Prokhorov claim that Shurik subverts the archetype of the positive Soviet hero through his bumbling inefficiency. After all, he also helped, if inadvertently, to kidnap Nina. I won't deny that the film encourages us to laugh at some of the things that Shurik gets wrong, but as Prokhorova herself acknowledges, this character was the epitome of a pure Russian soul for Gaidai. And this pureness is mediated by the form of whiteness. According to Prokhorova, Gaidai explicitly made the actor bleach his hair to achieve the isomorphism of concept and character. Far from undermining Soviet colonial mythologies then, this film, through Shurik, constructs the agent of the extremely violent Soviet colonialism, and I say extremely violent because a number of native populations of the North Caucasus and Krim or Crimea have been forcibly deported less than 30 years prior to the making of this film, in 1944 and 1945. So this film constructs Shurik, who is likable and pure, as the agent of this extremely violent colonialism, Shurik's only motivation, apparently, is to restore Nina's freedom and heteronormativity threatened by the violence of the Oriental man's libido. Of course, we all know that Russian Orientalism and colonialism were not motivated by protecting the rights of women in the Caucasus. Unfortunately, shards of these films' toxic Orientalist iconography can be found across all Gaidai's films. All Gaidai's films. The most obviously distressing example comes from the Operation Y trilogy. I know we're running short of time, but I'll just briefly show you the clip. very sorry for making people suffer through this clip, which takes Gaidai's racist views about the isomorphism of concept and character to their logical conclusion by articulating the drunk's antisocial and indeed anti-Soviet behavior, and we could say nature, through the form of tribal African blackface. While less obvious, all the Vinimore films use the tubiteka, a particular style of men's headgear, common in some Turkic cultures, as a shorthand for the near Oriental stupidity of Nikulin's Dunes character. Here is a shot from Barbaros, where Nikulin already wears the tubiteka, and here's another shot from The Woman Prisoner of the Caucasus, where he wears the tubiteka. Of course, Nikulin is white, although he is somewhat darker than arguably somewhat darker than the other Vinimore characters. As such, I would argue that we can read Vinimore as a personification of USSR's heteronationalism. I already talked about the sort of, by which I mean intersecting heteronormativity and Orientalism. Essentially, Vinimore are kind of a comedic personification of the Russian couple, with the Russian man exercising control over his prosthetic wife and his Oriental service, a servant in that order. So where does this leave us or me? Okay, I have to apologize for my potentially confusing and rushed talk. I'm a very nervous public speaker, but here are my research questions again, and kind of to remind everyone what this talk was about. And in brief, my answer to both these questions was yes. Whether convincingly or not, I argued that Gaidai's comedies function as ISAs that promote the unmarked heteronationalist ideology, heteronationalist basis of the Soviet Russian state. First, they do this by instrumentalizing Russian women for the construction of respectable Soviet Russian heteronation, with Soviet Russian man in charge. Second, these films objectify the Orient and its inhabitants into 2D symbols of barbarity and toxic sexuality in order to naturalize Soviet Russian colonialism as a protective civilizational form that is a protective civilizational force that protects Oriental women and restores a particular type of nuclear family heteronormativity. I think that's it.
Okay, thank you very much. That was an extraordinarily interesting and thought-provoking paper, Misha. The chat room, as they say on Strictly, I don't know, is now open. So if anybody has a question that they would like to put, I have one question, but I'm not quite sure what it is. Oh, it's "You're very welcome, Misha," from Rachel. Would anybody like to open the questions? I'll give you a couple of seconds to familiarize yourself with the chat function. If not, I have a question for Misha, but I'm happy to wait for anybody else. No? Okay, Misha, could I ask you about the hybrid nature of Nina in the film Kavkazskaya Plenniца, because you didn't say very much about that particular aspect of the film, and I'd be quite interested to hear what you have to say about her. And I suppose the question is related to largely this depiction of backwardness, threat, Oriental sort of threat in terms of the Caucasus or the Russian South, so-called. The reason I ask this question is because I wondered to what extent you felt that actually this stereotypical representation is based on a series of vestiges which are quite surprising in the context of the Soviet 1960s, and they seem to hark back to actually, say, the 1920s or early 1930s in terms of the emancipation of women, in Islamic societies and so on and so forth. And therefore, I suppose the question I want to ask you is whether the 1960s, the Thaw films, represent anything like a development in relation to this imagery of the 1920s, and whether they're still stuck in this same idea. I wondered if you could say a little bit more about that.
Okay, so could I kind of answer your question backwards?
Yeah.
What's quite interesting about a lot of research on the cinema of the Thaw is that they kind of suggest, look, you know, the censorship was slightly decreased, so the films became less problematic because they became less obviously ideological. But if we compare socialist realist cinema to the cinema of the Thaw, when it comes to Russian women, first of all, the cinema of the Thaw is much more conservative when it comes to the kind of roles it allows or reserves for the Russian woman. It constructs, as I tried to argue, maybe in a very rushed way, it constructs the Russian woman as primarily a mother who is allowed some sorts of occupations, but she's very much a secondary subject to the Russian man, who's really tasked with, first of all, enjoying himself, which the Russian woman doesn't get to do, at least in Gaidai's films, and secondly, with building the socialist world. And this sort of almost a gender regression happens precisely because censorship gets lessened, and sort of the Russian heteronational underpinnings of Soviet cinema are allowed to come out more strongly, because socialist realist cinema is really concerned with over-determining Russian heteronationalism with Soviet form, although of course it persists. And I think this is precisely why we see these really pervasive comedies being made, is because they speak to the Russian viewer, primarily as a Russian viewer. And that's why they are still popular to this day, because sort of some of the ideological formalist veneer of socialist realism and of the communist ideology is revealed, and we're allowed of kind of more direct glimpses of Russian racism, which is basically the basis of the Russian Empire, of the Soviet state, and of the Russian state today.
But when you, sorry, just to return to one part of my question, when you talk about Nina as a hybrid figure, what exactly do you mean? You mean a woman who is belongs to both cultures, as it were? I mean, she's obviously not emancipated, but she's not without agency as the film progresses. I just wondered what you meant by as a hybrid figure. You mean she partly belongs to this region, or is partly Sovietized, or is partly even Westernized in some respects?
Yeah, sorry, my brains are clearly not in the right place.
Don't worry.
So I think the easiest way to answer this is to turn to Fanon and the established canon of decolonial and postcolonial writing on the Algerian War and the French culture when it comes to the Maghreb. Yeah. A lot of French ideology and, you know, the French women in Algeria or something like this, it was a feminist organization that functioned in colonial Algeria, produced cultural products, both films, articles and other things that basically presented Frenchification or total assimilation into the colonial culture as the only path to assimilation for the local Algerian or Moroccan women. Of course, in Algeria, which was not a colony, but a département, local people were denied citizenship unless they could pass into Frenchness. And of course, it was never really about real emancipation, because French culture in the 60s, just like the Soviet culture of the 60s, the 70s, the 80s, was not a feminist or queer culture. It was a misogynist culture, as I also try, you know, a misogynist culture that constructed a very specific role for the woman as kind of a reproducer of the Soviet heteronation. And what I mean when I say that Nina is a hybrid is that the film basically constructs Nina as the only alternative which exists for the Oriental woman in the USSR to being subjugated by the Oriental man. And that alternative is not real emancipation. That alternative is subjugation, physical, iconographic, and reproductive, first of all, to the Russian man, and secondly, to the Soviet Russian nation.
Okay, thank you. I've got some questions here, which I'm going to read out, if that's okay, or you can, yeah, I think that's what we'll do. So the first one is from Anastasia, who says, I'm quite interested in your reading of the Morgunov character and his counterparts from other Gaidai films, Leolik and An Unnamed Prisoner. I wonder, what I wonder is whether Fedya from Operation E can also perhaps fall into this category of the brutally masculine bogatyr, and if yes, what do we make of his pairing with Shurik?
That is such a thought-provoking question, and the only thing I can say that yes, I think, I mean, I didn't read them as a pair, but I think, yeah, I think you're right. And I can't tell you off the top of my hand what we make of his pairing with Shurik, but definitely
maybe I could invite Anastasia to unmute herself, and maybe you want to elaborate on that question. It's up to you.
Hi, I really wish I could, but my surroundings are like in that clip with Shurik, you know, babysitting a child very much.
Okay.
So I could be interrupted at any moment. I don't have a particular reading of that, but that immediately came to my mind, and especially after you showed the clip with like Fedya in blackface, how the dynamics are reversed. So maybe it's if Fedya is this bogatyr and Shurik is in some way his prosthetic wife, it's the part when the wife is trying to get some of the agency. Maybe not. Maybe it's reading too much into Gaidai.
Thank you for that, Anastasia. Much appreciated. Yes, Misha.
Thanks, Anastasia, and I think you're right. And now that I'm thinking about what you said, I think one possible way to read this coupling is in terms of a duality between sort of a Russian bogatyr hypermasculinity, which maybe Gaidai is saying that, look, Russian hypermasculinity is more important than Soviet kind of Shurik's kind of sort of ideological Soviet student masculinity. And also, I think there might be a duality which also speaks to the Russian paranoia about sort of the virile masculinity of the Oriental, in this case, black man, because it is definitely possible to read the dynamics of this chase scene as a pursuit, or maybe a visual metaphor for rape, you know, for kind of the rape of our women by the sort of the Mongol or whatever herds, which is definitely a trope in Russian culture. But thank you so much, Anastasia. I really did not think about this, and it's something for me to think about.
Okay, I have another question from Jeremy Hicks, who says, many thanks, Misha. In drawing on Althusser's notion that ideology erases its own trace, for your analysis of these films, how would you relate this to Soviet films, where ideology is much more explicit? Are there perhaps two kinds of ideology in play, an implicit one and an explicit one? If so, how do they relate to each other?
Yes, I mean, thanks for the question, which obviously I also didn't get to. Yes, Soviet cinema production is quite obviously ideological, and maybe kind of related to what I said earlier. One of the interesting things about Gaidai is that perhaps Soviet ideology is kind of the veneer or the superstructure that is sometimes peeled by relaxations and censorship or by mishaps or chance, as was with the film Kinzadza, where the Soviet censorship didn't quite censor it properly. And then sort of Russian heteronationalism or Russian Orientalism is sort of the very naturalized ideology, which is the basis for sort of the explicit Soviet ideology. I'm not sure whether that makes sense, but it's also something Stuart Hall talks about in terms of the way, kind of how we decode cultural products, and that certain types of ideology, like for example, capitalism in the West, are so deeply ingrained that most of our readings of explicitly capitalist films tend to be negotiated, not oppositional readings, because we accept capitalism as natural. So that was kind of a tangent, but yeah, that's one thing to say.
Okay, there is another sort of question stroke comment. I'll read it out. You'll probably need to have it in front of you because it's a thought-provoking one. The person who's asked the question is not able to stay for the answer, but I think it would be quite interesting perhaps for you to give an answer, because I think that the question is one that some of us would probably be thinking about as well. So the chat goes, thank you for the talk. I think the analysis is very interesting and thorough. I especially liked how Misha approached two terms from their title, Queer and Russia Empire. I wonder if after some time after the work has been written, Misha could also reflect on the third term in the title, translating. What I mean is how the operation of applying theories like the ones mentioned occurs in more general power structures across east, west, north, south, and so forth. Unfortunately, I cannot stay for the answer, etc., etc. Do you want to take that question or offer some initial thoughts in relation to it?
Yes, and I mentioned briefly the literature on Russia's internal colonization by the people like Groys and Etkind. And in general, I will have a very sort of particular way of answering this question, which I'm not saying is the correct one. I find that a lot of academic literature, especially by sort of scholars of Russian culture, or maybe scholars from the post-Soviet sphere who write about the idea of translating queerness and decolonial theory to the Russian context, is that they center the Russian colonial subject and try to nitpick differences between the Western model and sort of the Russian epistemic model, so to speak. And my answer to this would again be rooted in Stuart Hall and the tradition of queer decolonial writing that basically says, look, colonized people and colonized cultures, such as the colonized cultures of Russia, do not have access to their culture in a form that's not adulterated by Russian colonialism. That means that we need to actively write our own new scripts. And in a way, it doesn't really matter whether the colonial culture thinks that certain Western theories shouldn't be applied to it due to sort of particular Russian specificities, because in a way, what my research is about decentering Russian culture and about kind of completely refusing to engage with it on its own terms. Of course, context needs to be paid for, but I think the overall sort of binary of Russian context and Western theory, which tends to be queer, decolonial, and gender theory, is unhelpful precisely because I do not want Russia and Russian culture and Russian specificity to figure. What I want to figure and what I want to do is I want to use not only Western theory, but a lot of Southern theory. And I mean, I talked about Stuart Hall that blends Western and sort of colonial and sort of Caribbean experiences. I mentioned Gayatri Spivak. And my research at Warwick relies a lot on sort of women of color writing and sort of theorizing from the global South. And it deploys it in a sort of almost a utilitarian way to point out certain exclusions that exist in the cultural meta text of Russian culture. I'm not sure whether that's a satisfactory answer, but
I think that's a more than satisfactory answer. And thank you very much for being willing to answer it. Are there any more questions that anybody wants to put? I don't have any more on the chat, and I can't see any more in the chat. And we have. Oh, we do have a question. Yeah.
Yeah. Right. Can I?
Yeah.
Yeah.
Fire away.
Hi. Thank you so much for your talk. I have to say that I don't study film, but I am myself Russian, so I'm kind of familiar with all this topic. I would like to go back to your interpretation of Vitsin's character in Kavkazskaya Plenitsa, Vitsin Smell and Flowers. If you remember different film by Gaidai, Не может быть, there was a character by Mikhail Pugovkin who responded to his wife, accusing him for being impractical, not providing for his family. Pugovkin told her that, if I remember correctly, по-вашему я розы нюхаю. So this whole phrase, in my sense, basically means that, basically relates to some specific kind of man who's impractical, etc. And those types of men were, I guess, sometimes portrayed in different films, Soviet-era films. For example, in Pokrovsky Vorota, if you remember. So I guess my question is, was there actual one specific normative masculinity, or several types of several types of men portrayed in those films? Does it really correspond? Does it really relates to some feminine qualities? I mean.
Yeah, thanks for that question. Honestly, I don't know how to answer it. If we look at some of the sort of post-Soviet cultural discourse, sort of the stereotypical members of the Soviet intelligentsia are often dismissed, sort of in Russian national discourse, for being too sort of apathetic, too sensual, and too almost effeminate. I mean, that's in post-Soviet Russia. But to a certain degree, in Soviet culture, there was a space for kind of, as you say, sort of a more sentimental. Yes, I'm sorry, I can't do better than that. I'm really sorry, but I guess even if okay, let me put it this way. In my opinion, in these specific films, even if the act of smelling flowers is in itself not necessarily non-normative or does not in itself connote sort of gender and sexual transgression, the kind of the couple dynamics are certainly there to interpret into kind of the relationship between these characters. Yeah, I'm not sure whether, yeah, I'm sorry, I really can't do better than that, but yeah. That's
okay, Misha. I mean, thanks very much for that question, and thank you for all the questions that have been put. I think we've run out of time really, and I think it's going to be difficult to sort of focus and concentrate and answer questions from now on. So it remains for me to thank you all for attending, and Misha, thank you very much for a really interesting talk and for coping with the technology and doing such a wonderful job. We're very much looking forward to seeing, I gather that some of your research has been published already, is that right? No, okay. Well, we're very much looking forward to seeing it. There are hands going up. What? Oh, clapping, right. Oh, excellent, right. It's a Zoom symbol. People are clapping, excellent. Anyway, thank you very much and look forward to seeing you all again on December the 2nd. So take care of yourselves and keep well. Thank you.